Jai Baba. This is the 13th session in our series on God Speaks. God Speaks is the master framework for Meher Baba's Darshana. This is the second to the last. We're almost at the end of them. And this session will be on the ninth part, the ninth chapter of God Speaks, called The 10 States of God. This slide here shows you the chart that this chapter is based on. In fact, it seems that this is where the book God Speaks began. Baba began with this chart, but as God Speaks developed, it wound up appearing almost at the end of the book instead of at the beginning. So let me give you a little bit of a history of this chapter, the 10 States of God. The 10 States of God was Meher Baba's definitive and final formulation of something that he had been bringing up again and again since the 1920s. If you look at this slide right here, this is from Infinite Intelligence, and here you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are actually states of God as Meher Baba was laying them out in that book, and they're presented in this chart, figure 28. So from the very beginning, Meher Baba was describing the reality and the extension of God in terms of a variety of states. In 1947, however, Baba began dictating content to a close disciple of his, Dr. Abdul Ghani, who wound up writing a manuscript which Baba didn't see before the beginning of the new life. It seems, however, that Baba wanted Ghani to be writing God Speaks. It appears to have been a movement towards that same thing. But after the new life, when Baba did read it, he was quite dissatisfied with what Ghani had done, and started all over again with Erich in Satara and Mahabaleshwar, 1953. However, Ghani really was the one among the Mandali who was most interested and most adept at these kinds of things. And it turns out that Ghani actually did write the original draft of this chapter. If you look at this slide, let me expand up here, you can see Chapter 2, the 10 States of God. The original draft of this chapter was indeed written by Dr. Ghani. This was quite a surprise to discover this just a few years ago. Because in the here, let me scroll through a couple pages and you can see a little bit of what it looks like. Here it is typed. It's not exactly the same as the chapter in the book. Erich was given the job to come up with the final draft of this, and he cut out, there's a lot of old material in Dr. Ghani's version from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and Erich cut a lot of that out and made other kinds of changes. But a lot of it is indeed word for word the same. Now here's a curious fact about the 10 States of God, this chapter. The authorship is explicitly attributed to Erich. If you look at this slide here, The 10 States of God by Erich B. Jeswala. Baba actually credited Erich with the authorship of this chapter. Gary Kleiner, one of our former residents, brought this up with Erich in the 1980s or 90s, whenever it was. And Erich didn't even know that the book, the chapter was in his name. And Gary brought it to him, and see, by Erich B. Jesawala. Erich didn't even know that. And what Erich said was, mine was the hand that wrote. In other words, all of this content really came from Baba. So these last two chapters of God Speaks are nominally authored by Erich Jesawala based on this chart which Baba had given in the 1940s. I personally consider this chapter of God Speaks to be the most important single statement of Meher Baba's Darshana. I'm using that way, for Meher Baba's spiritual philosophy. The most important single statement anywhere. Now, there are a lot of other important and really major articulations of his Darshana, but in a succinct form, this is captures the essentials, the fundamentals of it in a very succinct way. Now, in the course of this series, I've kept bringing up the subject of the divine theme, the journey of the soul from the beginning, God's whim to know himself, through this vast spread of creation to the realization of God. And according to my understanding, God Speaks traces its way through the divine theme 3 times. I've kept saying this. The first time is chapters 2 to 7. The second time is in chapter 8, which we just went over in the last 3 sessions. Actually, chapter 8 goes further than just the divine theme. It also includes Baba's explanation of the 4 journeys and the avatar. But this chapter 9 is the third passage through the divine theme, and what makes it unique, and here is the chart once again, is that Baba has lifted the divine theme narrative out of time and expressed it as eternal states of God. So let me explain that. The divine theme is a storyline. Whose story? Ours, each one of us. How we began when God asked the question, who am I? We began as stones and fish and, birds and animals and people and so forth. And then through the planes of involution until you realize God. This is a storyline. It's like our biography. It can be characterized, the divine theme can be characterized as the biography of the soul itself. Baba was telling this because people like stories. It's an interesting story, Mother has a kid, and what does she do? Does she give a discourse on philosophy? No, she tells a story to her children. So Baba was doing that. But in this chapter, Baba lifts this story out of time and represents it as states of God that are always there, perennial states of God. Which are these? In fact, on this page, Baba lists them. So let's run through them. The first is God in the beyond state. The second is God in the beyond state, substates A, B, and C. The third is God as emanator, sustainer, and dissolver. The fourth is God as the embodied soul. The fifth is God in the state of evolution. I don't know, can you see the progress of the divine theme here? From the original state of God, we're now getting through evolution. Number 6 is God as human soul in the state of reincarnation. The 7th is God in the state of spiritually advanced souls on the subtle and mental planes, the first, 6 planes. The 8th state is God as the divinely absorbed. That is to say, people who have realized God and are completely absorbed in God. Strictly speaking, the divine theme ends here. But in his account of the 4 journeys, as I explained last time, Baba talks about Shivatmas, or God-realized personalities, who go further than this, most don't. Most realize God and they're finished. But there are a few who return to creation consciousness. So in the 9th state of God, God as liberated incarnate soul, we'll talk about this presently, and the 10th state of God is God as man-God and God-man. That is to say, perfect master and avatar. These then are the 10 states of God, and this diagram shows it. Taking a look at this diagram here. So you see at the beginning, God in the beyond state, the original pristine state of God. The second is God in the beyond state, and you can see here A, B, and C, right? Can you see those 3? A, B, and C. Those are the 3 substates of the beyond state of God. The third is God as emanator, sustainer, and dissolver. You could say creator, preserver, destroyer, same thing. In earlier dictations, Baba called this Ishwar, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, those 3. The fourth is God as the embodied soul. Indic term for this would be a jivatma. That is a soul that is identified with some form. It begins with like particles or stones or metals, and through the series of evolution, you get all the way to human beings. All of these are embodied souls. The 5th state of God is actually God as soul in the state of evolution. And you can see here stones, metals, vegetables, worms, fishes, birds, animals, and it culminates with God achieving the human form. As we've mentioned before, and as Baba explains in this chapter, the human form is actually latent in all of these forms. The human form is there from the very beginning, but it's all folded in on itself. But when you complete the evolutionary descent, the human form, the perfect image of God, is fully manifested. And thus you get to the 6th state of God, human. God as human being in the state of reincarnation. Now, if you notice, God on the beyond state is up on top, and God in human form is on the bottom. This expresses a fundamental truth, that human beings are the farthest from God. We're fully conscious, but we become conscious through the accumulation of sanskaras. And these have put us at a maximum distance from the experience of God. We're much farther from God than stones are. Stones are very close to God. It's just that they're not conscious at all. So you actually achieve in full consciousness the greatest state of distance. But now the return journey begins. So here's the 7th state of God here, the gross world, subtle world, and mental world. Through the course of involution, that's the word Baba used for this, the soul progresses through these 3 spheres. The subtle world is the first 3 planes. The 4th plane is the threshold between the subtle and the mental. And the mental world is the 5th and 6th planes. And then here on the 8th state of God, God as the divinely absorbed. This is where the soul, this is the goal is achieved. The goal of creation is achieved here. You have the I am God experience. Aham Brahmasmi, Anal Haq. One who has merged in the 8th state of God is called a majub. or a Hindu term Baba used for this is a Brahmi Bhut. These Shivatmas, these God-realized persons, experience God, and creation does not exist for them. Creation has completely disappeared from the screen of their experience. Now, this is no loss because, as Baba has said, creation actually doesn't exist at all. It's nothing. It's just an appearance. So they're experiencing things as they really are. Creation has vanished completely and forever. And most people who complete the divine theme, the journey of the divine theme, stop here. There's no reason to, seek anything more. Time has ended. Space has ended. You're merged with God. There are a few who go on to the ninth state of God. You see 9 here. This is the Divine Junction. And I'll be saying more about all of these. But at this state, okay, I'll go to what I talked about last time. Just past the Divine Junction, you reach the state that Baba called Baka Bila, or Sahaj Samadhi was a Indic term Baba used for this. And in this state, the Shivatma, the God-realized soul, has the I am God experience, but simultaneously is fully conscious of the gross, subtle, and mental spheres, knows everything in creation, is fully conscious of the entirety of creation. However, such a one has no duty, does not act out of this state. Now, if you bump into such a person, you benefit, but they don't have a circle and they don't do any work to speak of in a major way. That's the 9th state of God. The 10th state of God, this one here, God as man-God and God-man, that is perfect master and avatar. Both of them occupy the 10th state of God. And as I was talking about last time with the 4 journeys, the first journey is completed when you get to the 8th state of God. The second journey is completed when you get just past the 9th state of God into Baka Bila. The third journey is completed when you reach the 10th state of God as a perfect master. Only a few do this. And after a perfect master drops the body, they go back to the 8th state of God. That's the 4th journey, experiencing the I am God state again. Perfect masters are gone. Once they've lived their lives, they return to the God state and have no more role in creation. It's only the avatar who keeps coming back again and again and again, forever. He's the only one who does that. So those are the 10 states of God in summary. So now let's say a bit more about each of them. And this chapter is dedicated to going through these individually. Here's what this chapter starts to look like God in the beyond state. This is the original state of God. And in this state, God defies all description and all characterization. Baba says in this chapter that people who have tried to describe, perfect ones, God-realized persons, who have tried to describe the first state of God, the beyond state, wind up describing the second state of God, the beyond state, because the first cannot be described. Nothing can be said about it at all. You can only talk about it in terms of negatives. It's neither, okay, I'll read a little bit. This state of God is so transcendent that nothing can really be conceived of it. So this is the description of the first state of God that we find in the text. I'm going to read little bits of it. This state of God is so transcendent that nothing can really be conceived of it. It is utterly pure and immaculate and has no tinge of otherness. It is the hidden of all hidden knowledge and the internal of all internal realities. It is beyond all words, and so cannot be adequately described. It is neither finite nor infinite. Get that? You can't even say it's infinite. It is neither finite nor infinite, neither attributeless nor with attributes. That would be nirgun or sagun, would be the Indic words for that. In this domain, the wings of thought, inference, discrimination, and understanding are limp and useless. Then he quotes this couplet from Hafez. I'll read the translation. He cannot be described by the mind, therefore do not exert yourself to understand him. He is free of all directions, therefore do not try to seek him anywhere. Meher Baba says that when one who has realized this state of God tries to describe it to others, this act results in a description not of the first, but of the second state of God, God in the beyond state. So that applies even to this. The human mind simply can't understand it. I'm going to read a little bit more because this is so good. It is the eternity of eternities. Here, all indications are blotted out. Mankata ul izarat, since no other thing exists that can be pointed out or referred to. So this original state, in this original state, God does not have self-knowledge. He does not have the I am God experience. At the same time, you can't really say that he doesn't have it either. There is no description at all that actually pertains to this state. That's where everything begins. And this is me speaking now. It seems to me that you can't even say that this is what happened before the beginning, because this has no relation to time or space. This is a state of God beyond any characterization in terms of time at all. That's the beyond state of God. Now, the second state of God, as you can see here, in fact, I'm going to jump back to the chart, which is most useful in this respect. If you see the chart here, whoops. In fact, let me go to this one. Maybe I can squeeze it all into a single. Yeah, here we go. So you see, here's the second state of God. You see that? And it has A, B, and C. There are 3 substates to the second state of God. And Baba kept saying, this section on the second state of God is probably the most difficult and in many ways the deepest section of this chapter. The great philosophers are going to be having great fun with this for 700 years. Now, he said that the first and the second states of God are in no way different from each other. The difference, Baba said, comes from the substates, A, B, and C. Now, this is really paradoxical, and let me illustrate why that is. In the second state of God, God is unconscious, infinite unconsciousness. In 2A. In 2B, that's over on the left-hand side, God is infinitely conscious of himself, is self-aware. How can this be one state of God, where in the one he's infinitely unconscious, and in the other he's infinitely conscious of himself? And in state C, but he's only infinitely conscious of himself, he's not conscious of creation. But in state C, God is conscious of himself and conscious of all creation also. These are the 3 substates. So the beyond state of God encompasses all of this. And yet, Baba says, it's fundamentally indifferentiable from the first state of God. How can that possibly be? We're dealing with something that goes quite beyond the mind. Baba gave a beautiful analogy for some of this. He said, God as infinite unconsciousness and God as infinite consciousness. That would be states 2A and 2B, right? Those are infinite unconsciousness, infinite consciousness, arose concurrently. And this, Baba said, is something beyond the understanding of the intellect. Only when you realize God can you really understand this. But he also said, to give the human mind some glimpse of how this can be, consider the case of a fetus in a mother's womb. The baby starts to develop within the mother, and as the baby develops, its eyes start to develop. At a certain moment, the eyes reach a point of development where they can both see and not see at the same time, right? Doesn't that make sense? When the eyes are developed, you develop at the same moment both capacities. This is how it is. This is an analogy for how infinite unconsciousness and infinite consciousness concurrently arise. Now, Baba says other things here. I'm just going to give my own description of it. You'd have to read this section, which, as I say, is very deep and very difficult, actually. He's trying to describe how the beyond state and the beyond state differ from each other. And he says, just at the moment that the whim is about to surge within the ocean of God's reality, perspectiveness, he says, becomes inconceivable. Now, what does this exactly mean? Baba doesn't really explain this, so this is the best I can do with this. You're in the beyond state where there's no consciousness, there's no unconsciousness, there are no attributes, no attributelessness. At the instant, perspectiveness would be perspectiveness towards what? Looking ahead toward the possibility of creation, right? And it becomes inconceivable. The moment it becomes inconceivable, it happens. And thus, the Jivatma's first experience is of contrariety. Some of you may remember that from much earlier, because this is an impossible thing. I am infinite God, and I'm experiencing myself as a most finite particle. So the moment the perspectiveness of a emergent creation becomes inconceivable, the whim occurs. And that whim occurs, and Baba uses the word insurge, not the surge of the whim, the insurge of the whim. Why is it an insurge? It can't go out anywhere because God's beyond state contains everything. It is a surging within itself, and the question, who am I, arises. So this is his explanation of these three states and how this emergent inconceivability, you can't, in other words, you couldn't even begin to imagine a perspectiveness. The possibility of a creation happening can't even be imagined or thought about. And then, of course, the next instant it happens. You do have such a whim, and the creation does come out of it, out of the whole thing. Of course, Baba also says the creation never really happens. It's all totally imaginary. Okay, so there's a very brief little introduction to the beyond state of God. Once again, here's the chart showing it. So A, B, and C, right? And the entire journey of the soul is from A to B. That is, from God 2A to 2B. God in the infinitely unconscious state to God in the infinitely conscious self-knowing state, right? In other words, in 2a, God asks, who am I? And in 2b, God says, I am God. The whole journey is from A to B. But to get there, you have to here's 2a, right? You have to do this whole long trip down through the evolution of consciousness, human form, the involution of consciousness, all the way up to here, the 8th state of God, which is the realization of 2b. This is all to go from God's infinitely unconscious state to God's infinitely self-conscious state. It's actually a very beautiful, clear, kind of simple explanation in its core. So God asks, who am I in 2a? And God says, I am God in state 2b. Everything comes out of that. Okay, so that's the second state of God. Now we'll come to the third state. Now, the third state of God, as depicted right here on the chart, C3, God as emanator, sustainer, and dissolver. Other terms often used are creator, preserver, destroyer. Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh are other terms used for this. Now, Baba says that God's whim, which arose in the beyond state of God, that's where it erupted, necessitates the emergence of the third state of God, because for the drop soul to have experiences within creation, the nothing, which is inherent in God's everything, has to manifest as the false everything. Some of you who listened to other earlier sessions will remember this. The nothing is manifests as nothingness, and that is the entire creation that we see before us. It's nothingness, which we take to be everything. It's the false everything, right? Well, there has to be an aspect of God that proliferates this, that spreads this before our eyes. And that is accomplished by God as emanator, sustainer, dissolver, who keeps creating, preserving, and destroying everything. Without that, we could never have any experiences. And what does God create, preserve, and destroy? Nothing, because it doesn't even exist. But it's nothing pretending to be something, nothing that we believe to be really existent, but which does not. This is all under the jurisdiction of the third state of God, which elsewhere Baba has called by the name of Ishwar. You may have seen images in some Hindu temples of Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. That's who this is. Brahma is the creator, Vishnu, preserver, Mahesh, or Shiva as the destroyer. We talked about this 2 or 3 sessions back, but Baba explains that these 3 aspects are actually all parts of one state of God, and they're ineluctably tied to each other. For this reason, that in the very act of creation is implied the need to preserve what you create. Why would you create if you did not want to preserve it? For a jivatma, for a drop soul, to experience something, the thing that's created needs to be held in place for the soul to experience, right? If it doesn't even linger for an instant, nobody can actually have the experience of it. So creation has preservation as part of the structure of its own nature, you might say. But when you preserve, what is presumed is that you're preserving it against destruction, which is bound to follow sooner or later. So preservation creation, preservation, and destruction are three parts of the same thing, of the same one state of God. And they are going on at every instant. In a previous session, we talked about how Brahma creates the past from our sanskaras. Vishnu, the preserver, the sustainer, sustains that past presented as the present. And then Mahesh or Shiva destroys it as the experience passes on from one experience to the next. Our streaming of experience is made possible by Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, creator, preserver, destroyer. It is constantly functioning for every jivatma every second of your existence. So this is a very fundamental and very important state of God. Now, Baba also says about this third state of God that Ishwar knows everything in creation, but he does not know that he is God. Ishwar does not have the I am God experience. And why would that be? Because creator, preserver, destroyer, the third state of God, is so focused on the creation that never for one instant does Ishwar turn his glance back upon himself. Never for 1 second does he contemplate himself. He's totally absorbed with the creation. Now, from our point of view, Ishwar is the same as God. Has all the attributes of God, all the powers of God, all the activities that we attribute to God are there with Ishwar. But Ishwar does not have the I am God experience. So this is an interesting fact that Baba revealed about the Creator. This certainly wasn't known in any of the Abrahamic faiths about this state of God. And to repeat this point again, when we talk about the Creator, whenever you use the word Creator in the context of Baba's Darshana, what you mean is Creator, Preserver, Destroyer, all three, inevitably. And in reality, creation never happens because nothing is there to get created. It's nothing being created as nothingness, which does not really exist. But souls in the grip of Maya, that is us, Jivatmas, impute reality to it, even though it is not really there. So you see the point? Creation never happens. Creation is completely in imagination. But we take it to be real because of our sanskaras which bind us to this. This is the third state of God then. Now the fourth state of God, actually in his discussion of, this is a fairly extended discussion. Let me show you. Here are some of the pages you can see. Here, page 170, you can see God as embodied soul. And it goes on for quite a few pages. And in this section, Baba gives a creation narrative. There are 3 places in God Speaks where Baba really gives the creation narrative and talks about the whim of God that produced the creation. The first time is at the beginning of chapter 2. We dealt with this in a previous session. The second time is at the beginning of chapter 8, where there's a fairly extended treatment of the topic. And the third time is here, God as the embodied soul. And when I first noticed this, I was puzzled and said, well, why does he include it here? Well, this is why. This is where the drop soul comes into the picture. Notice in the first 3 states of God, you don't have individualized souls. The Jivatma is the individual's drop soul. They're not in the picture yet. The drop soul only comes into the picture now. So it's at this point where the drop starts to experience itself as limited and finite, and has therefore the experience of what Baba calls contrariety. We dealt with this term earlier back in chapter 2, and the term comes up again here. What is contrariety? Well, the drop, the soul, the Atma, is actually identical with Paramatma, the ocean, the Oversoul. It's actually the same. Baba uses that metaphor in this section, actually. He develops it again. If you imagine an infinite, unlimited ocean, and you think about a single drop within that ocean, well, there's no difference. If you don't differentiate, the drop is the ocean, right? That's the reality of things. But now, as Baba describes it, the drop acquires a bubble. He uses that metaphor. It imagines that it is something separate from the ocean as a whole. And the first bubble experience that it has is of being infinitely finite and limited. The most primitive sanskara, Baba calls it stone, but it's actually, it's something much like an electron. Well, the Atma is actually Almighty God, infinite power, knowledge, bliss. And here it is experiencing itself as supremely constrained. It can't do a damn thing. It's so confined within its body, it's hardly conscious of anything. And the experience contains within it the feeling something is wrong here. What I am experiencing is contrary to the reality of things. This is not who I really am. That's what contrariety means. So the first experience that the Jivatma has is one of radical variance with the truth of things. And that dissatisfaction, that experience of contrariety, prods and drives the Jivatma all the way through the entire journey of the soul. Even in, a great saint is experiencing the agony of love for God. Why do you experience agony? Because the soul wants to be one with God. Why does the soul want to become one with God? Because it actually is one with God. This is just an illusion that it is otherwise. So it is at this point with the embodied soul that that experience starts. It didn't occur in the previous states of God. Now, here is another thing I had wondered about, returning again to the 10 States of God chart. Okay, here is, right here, God is the embodied soul, and then number 5 is stone, metal, vegetable, worm, fish, bird, animal, human. Well, aren't they embodied souls? So doesn't the 4th state of God, isn't it redundant? Aren't those embodied souls too? And this is what I think about that now. By making the 4th state of God the embodied soul, Baba is enunciating the principle of embodiment, of the soul identifying itself with a body because of myopic ignorance and believing itself to be that and experiencing the universe through that form. It's the principle of embodiment itself. So that's why in this section of the chapter, Baba goes through a fairly extensive creation narrative. It's well worth reading. And when you read it, compare it again with the opening pages of chapter 8 and the opening pages of chapter 2. Those 3 sections relate to each other. At the very end of this section, Baba has a curious passage, which I'm not sure that I really understand it, but let me just call your attention to it. It's, okay. The first medium adopted by God in his state 4, God is embodied soul, is a first form which, although it is gross, yet it is so inconceivably, infinitely finite that it cannot even be considered as gross. It is so very infinitely shapeless and substanceless, matterless and formless, that it cannot lead one even to imagine that it is gross. This makes me think of particle physics nowadays and all these, strain quarks and spins and everything else that they're discovering when you go below the atomic level. Yet, this form is the very first gross form that emerges Now, here's the curious thing. Emerges simultaneously as if in three prongs, as the first three of the foremost 7 gas-like forms. So what Baba says is there are 7 gas-like forms. He's not talking about hydrogen or helium. He's talking about something more primitive, on a more primitive level of consciousness than that. And he says it comes out in 3 prongs. I have no idea what that means, but I just put that out there. I'm sure that in the future people will make progress in understanding it. Baba says, if a description of these first 3 gas-like forms could ever be attempted, they could only be described from the standpoint of density. The first having infinitely negligible density, then in the next stage, negligible density, and in the third stage as having the first traces of density. These first 3 forms have no evolution. So apparently evolution starts with the 4th of these 7 forms. So I'm just going to leave. I actually have some thoughts and suggestions on this, but this isn't the right. But apparently evolution begins with the 4th of these gas-like forms. The first 3, there's no evolution that happens, apparently. So that's a fascinating and rather enigmatic passage. Okay, now here in the 5th state of God, God as a soul in the state of evolution. Now this Baba has already covered in chapters 2 and 3, and this is more or less a recapitulation of that. The Jivatma identifies with forms in a series, an evolutionary series, progressing from one form to another on basis of its sanskaras. That is to say, the soul identifies with a particular form, which its sanskaras have made it accessible to it. It experiences its sanskaras and builds up new sanskaras. And since it has acquired more sanskaras, with that it has acquired more consciousness. And now it needs a more developed form, a more complex form. And it moves to a more sophisticated form in the evolutionary series. And what drives it is this whim, God's whim to know who am I, and infinite knowledge, power, and bliss as God's triune nature, which are continuously pushing and expanding the Jivatma towards greater and greater knowledge and greater consciousness. So driven by this, the soul progresses through a long series of forms. Baba says actually 8,400,000 species of forms, not individual forms, species, in the evolutionary trek to human form. But these, broadly speaking, break into what Baba calls 7 kingdoms of evolution. The first is what he calls stone form, and he means by this going all the way back to the electron. That is kind of inert matter, right? The next would be metal forms. The third would be plant forms. Here, life starts to emerge into the story. After this is what Baba calls worm forms, and he means to encompass in this category of worms insects, worms, amphibians, reptiles. That is, creatures with the tendency to crawl. Sometimes they have shells, sometimes they don't have shells. There's a lot of variety within this. But now we're dealing with animate life forms. Plant forms can't don't have voluntary motion. They can attach themselves to something, but they can't move. But in worm form, now the soul can move. The fifth form is fish. The sixth form is birds. And the seventh is animals, by which Baba really means mammals. So you progress through these fundamental kingdoms of evolution. Baba has said this before. We've gone over all this before. One new point that Baba does bring up in this treatment of the topic is this, that within each series, within each kingdom, the first and last species occupies a special position. They have a special seat. Like the last fish form and the first bird form, for example, have a special role. And elsewhere, Baba has said that they look both ways. They have a dual orientation, like the last fish form would be looking back towards birds and ahead towards fish, because it's about to make a leap from one kingdom to another. Baba has said what several of these are. For example, the last fish form is apparently a crab. Baba said the first animal form is kangaroo. Yeah, after the birds. Right after the birds, the first is a kangaroo. The last bird form, Baba said, is, he didn't name the species, but he described it. It sounds like a turkey. You know what a turkey with a long red wattle? And they don't fly very much. Whereas the first bird form is like a waterfowl, a duck, something like that. They're coming from fish, and thus they're much connected with water still. Then they fly as an eagle, but at the end of the bird form series, you come down to the earth again as a chicken and then a turkey, because now you're going to become land-based again. So these first and last forms, Baba said, have a special significance. And Baba also mentioned, or this is from Erich, and it's a little bit garbled in God Speaks. Unfortunately, this explanation which Baba gave in 1927 was never clearly written down, but it would seem that the latent human form is going through a series of turns, so that in the end, the human form as man and woman can stand upright. The whole evolutionary journey is to achieve that goal. And at the beginning, okay, I won't even try to talk about God Speaks. I think Erich, following Ghani, got it wrong, frankly. But in worm form, okay, in plant form, the human form is upside down. The head is under the ground. It falls flat in worm form, and through the various, bird, fish, and so forth, animal, it gradually stands up until you achieve a vertical posture in the human form. So this is another part of the evolutionary story. Okay. Now, a lot of these things we're coming to now, we've already seen, and this section doesn't really add much more. But in reincarnation, the full consciousness of the Jivatma has been achieved. In the beginning, God asked the question, who am I? Okay, well, to answer that question, God has to be conscious, right? You have to be awake. So the whole evolutionary progression was for the purpose of gaining consciousness. That was what it was for. It's motivated, it's purposeful. In human form, you're conscious. But the tragedy is that the Jiva has completely forgotten why it did this, because it acquired consciousness by picking up more and more and more sanskaras. So by the time you become the first human being, in your last lifetime, you are a monkey. And as a monkey, what were you interested in? Fighting with other monkeys, having sex, eating bananas, living in trees, screeching. Those are your preoccupations. And so you begin your career as a human being with all those impressions. Monkeys are very violent too. They kill each other all over the place. Animals do, have all these characteristics which are carried over into the human form. So you start to cycle and recycle these old samskaras and live an animalistic life. And it takes millions of lifetimes before the human soul starts to mature. One step, and this isn't in God Speaks, other places Baba talks about this, but you start to eventually develop a little bit of a moral sense. I shouldn't do bad things. And gradually you even arise above the moral level until the point comes where you become so dissatisfied with the fact that this goes on and on and on, and you never seem to get out of it. The problem is not death. The problem is that we can't die. The problem is that death doesn't work. What? Yeah.
That's very interesting that being coming from animals, we enjoy these kind of eating food, having
Yeah.
sex, and living lavish life, something like that, enjoying all the perks of life, and then we develop some moral codes that
Yeah.
we should eat regularly, but not that much, and all these kind of things. And even human
Hmm.
being into that moral code make us smartness,
Makes us what?
make life smartness. Why that moral code is there?
Yeah.
Why we are trying to have that, consume those sanskaras?
Yeah.
And you said that even then human being become it's like boring for human being, like why
Yeah.
we are creating these boundaries, why there is moral code, and why this we have to consume all these things, and
Yeah.
then we realize that we are not for here for these kind of things.
Yeah. 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 I think the moral code, at first, the moral code is imposed by others.
Mm-hmm. By
Other
the
people
authority of
condemn
others.
you. Eventually, you start to internalize it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't do it because I believe it's wrong, not because I'm afraid someone else will punish me. I think what the moral code is a developing awareness of the law of karma.
Okay.
You become aware that actions have consequences, and that if I perform bad actions, I will suffer. But you actually have to rise above that level too,
Also, yeah.
because it's not enough just to be good. Good brings happiness, but good does not set you free.
It's also related.
Yeah, it's within that cycle of good and bad, all that. So it's a vast amount of experience you need to have as a human being until you move into the seventh state of God, which is God as an advanced soul. And there you start to learn not just to exchange one set of sanskaras for another. Like, let's suppose I've had bad sanskaras and I live a good life and get good sanskaras. Okay, it's all within this cycle still. I haven't. I have just a new bunch of sanskaras. They might be better sanskaras. They might make me happier, but I'm still not free. It's only when you get into the seventh state of God, which is here, that you start to, up here on the left-hand side, the gross, subtle, and mental spheres, that you start to spend sanskaras without getting new ones. Now, God Speaks doesn't have much to say about how you do this, but Baba does talk about it in other books, but it's not here. He simply gives a description of the 6 planes of consciousness. So, when you go from the gross world into the first plane of the subtle sphere, the gross world disappears from your field of vision. You stop experiencing it your body still functions in the gross world kind of automatically. You can use it, but you're actually not conscious of it anymore. You're conscious of the subtle sphere and the domain of energy or pran. In the second plane, you become conscious of much greater energy, and in the third plane, tremendous energy becomes available to you. So these planes are all within the subtle sphere. The fourth plane is on the threshold between the subtle and the mental sphere. In the fourth plane, you acquire command of the powers of God, actually. You could raise the dead. You can create universes teeming with life. You can actually do all of that. But these are borrowed powers. And Baba says that if you make bad use of them, you suffer a calamitous, catastrophic fall all the way back down to stone form. This is the one real disaster that can happen on the spiritual path, on the fourth plane. Nowhere else can you suffer a disaster like this, but on the fourth plane you can. So Baba, in God Speaks, keeps warning about it, and he does once again in this chapter. On the fifth plane, once you cross the fourth, you enter into the domain of the mind. And on the fifth plane, you're conscious of thoughts. Energy disappears from your vision. The gross world is gone. If you looked at another person, you would see a body of thoughts. When you get to the sixth plane, thoughts disappear, and you're conscious of feelings only. Feelings are higher than thoughts, actually. And it's there that you experience the agony of love for God. Real love happens on the sixth plane of consciousness. And then, so this is all the seventh state of God. Baba has gone over this in previous chapters. So this is essentially a recapitulation of what he has said before. Do you want to close that window? Is it the getting into here? It's okay? Okay, because it's a directional mic. Okay, so now we're through the seventh state of God. Now here, in the eighth state of God, the goal is achieved. Now you may remember state 2B, right? 2A and 2B. Well, now in the eighth state of God, you consciously realize state 2B. State 2A, God is infinite unconsciousness, was what precipitated the whole thing. Everything came out of that. God is infinitely unconscious, had the desire to know himself, and so the whole progression through states 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 followed from that. But in the eighth state of God, God is the divinely absorbed. You experience state 2B. You experience God as infinite knowledge, power, and bliss. And the universe is gone for you. That happens because the universe, the creation, does not really exist at all. It was all imagination. The imagination disappears from your field of vision. So most people go no further than this because there's no reason to go any further. This is the reality. You're experiencing the reality. It makes a difference from the standpoint of other people who are still in ignorance. It matters a lot for them. But for the person concerned, the journey is over and the goal is achieved. And Baba says that there are always a certain number of people in the eighth state of God, divinely absorbed, who keep their bodies. Usually your body just falls off. It doesn't make any difference to you at all. You're completely unconscious of your body. It matters not one whit. But nonetheless, for the purposes of God's work, it is useful. God has a use for certain people who are having this experience, whose bodies still hang on there. They become channels for his work, and they're called majubs. Baba worked with certain majubs during the course of his mission. So majub is one of the words for it, and Brahmi Bhut is another term he gave. Majub was the usual term that he used. So this is the 8th state of God. Now, in the ninth state of God, we haven't properly explained this until now. It's called the Divine Junction. And here, those Shivatmas, those God-realized souls who have this destiny, return to creation consciousness. In the Divine Junction, Baba says, you're at that stage where sometimes you experience God and sometimes you experience the creation. You flicker back and forth. Baba used the term for people in this state, the Baba fixed, was Paramhansa. A Paramhansa is someone who is in this state. Sometimes you're this and sometimes you're that. This is part of the process of returning to creation consciousness. So the 9th state of God has Paramhansas who are in that state. But the 9th state of God, if you cross the Divine Junction, you become established in the state where you're constantly conscious of God and creation. The people in this state are called Jivan Muktas. A Jivan Mukta. These are terms often used in Hinduism, but Baba gave them a very precise and fixed meaning here. So Paramhansa is a sometime thing. Sometimes you're in the God state, sometimes in the I am human state. But Jivan Mukta is established in Baka Bila, as we explained last time, or Sahaj Samadhi, and is always fully conscious of the creation. However, neither Paramhansas nor Jivan Muktas have duty in creation. They're both conscious of creation, a Paramhansa off and on, a Jivan Mukta all the time. They have full consciousness of creation, but they don't have work, and they don't have responsibility towards souls in creation. Now, if you bump into one, you'll benefit enormously. They'll do you good. I mean, if you have contact, they'll help you. You know, it's not like they won't do anything for you. But they don't proactively take on a major role within the creation. A Jivan Mukta, Baba says, will give God realization to one person. So there is one person who benefits. In the chapter 8, we saw 3 kinds of perfect ones, and Baba used the term a Kamal, an Akmal, and a Mukamil. These are Arabic terms. A Kamal, as used in that chapter, refers to a Jivan Mukta. There is a rare kind of perfect one, and you'll see it in chart 11 and in the glossary here, an Akmal, who apparently is capable of giving realization to many people. But Baba hasn't really said much more about what an Akmal is. A Mukamil is the term for a perfect master. And now we come to the 10th state of God here. These are Shivatmas, God-realized persons, who have not only returned to full, complete creation consciousness, but have a duty within creation consciousness. So if you look back on the 2nd state of God, there's 2A, 2B, and 2C, right? 2A is where the whole creation comes out of. 2B is the state experienced consciously by majubs, the divinely absorbed. 2C is that state with creation, with self-knowledge of the I am God state, with full creation consciousness. And these perfect masters and the avatar both occupy the 10th state of God. Both of them do. And there's this chart, it's a bit blurry in this figure, but this shows the different layers to the individuality of the perfect master and the avatar also. They have gross body, they have gross, subtle, and mental bodies just like we do. They have a regular mental body and a regular subtle body, but then they have other bodies beyond that, a universal body, a universal mind. What is the infinite divine ego, and infinite consciousness? All of these are there. These are different layers to the individuality of the perfect master or the avatar. This is a topic that is well worth studying also. So once the Shivatma has achieved the 10th state of God, he or she lives out a career as a perfect master, and dropping the body, returns then to the 8th state of God, and they're done. The avatar also occupies this 10th state of God, but the avatar is unique in that he keeps returning every 7 to 1400 years. After dropping the body, the avatar retires to the 8th state of God. But the 5 perfect masters pull the avatar down again at the time of the next advent. The avatar is the only one for whom this is true. So now, right at the very end of this chapter of the 10 states of God, Baba does a recapitulation, which is right here, a summarization of these different stages. So the first stage is the infinite unconscious state. The second stage is God as a Jivatma. Atma gains consciousness and has impressions. This is the soul all the way from stone to six-plane saint. The third stage is the Atma becoming God-realized. The fourth stage is the return to consciousness of creation and okay, no, this is the 9th state of God, actually, and the 5th stage is the 10th state of God. So we have a summary of the 10 states of God that comes at the very end of the chapter. So that's a summary of the 10 states of God. And let me repeat the point I made earlier. You can see a narrative, like here's in this chart once again, when you trace your way from the beyond state through the beyond, through God as creator, preserver, destroyer, embodied soul, evolution, human form, and so forth, you can see the narrative of the 10 states of God by tracing your way through these states. But one essential transformation Baba has made in his account is that he's explained there actually is nothing that happens. These are eternal states of God. At Mahapralaya it all dissolves. But as long as there is a creation, these states are always there. So Baba has taken his divine theme narrative in this chapter and lifted it out of time to the domain of the timeless. I think that is a brilliant stroke that Baba has done in this, his third pass through the narrative of the divine theme. So that completes our coverage of the first 9 chapters of God Speaks. We'll have one more session, and the last chapter is very, very short. So what I think I'll do is devote the first part of the last session to a few comments on the subject of the supplement. There's a big, long supplement. I'm not going to try to cover it in detail because that would take another 10 sessions all by itself. But I'll say a little bit about it. And then we'll come to the last chapter, part 10, which is a palinode, is the technical term for it. It's almost like Baba does a retraction of the whole book. That's the rhetorical trope that he uses. That will be next time, and that will be the end of this series of talks. So, Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai.